We have another fabulous keynote speaker for you. This man's name is David Mandel. He's been working in the domestic violence field for 25 years. He does international training and consulting and focuses on system responses to domestic violence when children are involved. And he also was talking a lot about fatherhood and the role of fathers, and also some innovative work that he's been doing with fathers. David has developed this Safe and Together model to improve case practice and cross-system collaboration in domestic violence cases involving children. Please help me welcome David Mandel.
See if the mic is working. Okay, great. Good afternoon. Thank you for having me here this afternoon. It's great to be doing work with home visitors. I've spent years, as Irene introduced me, doing a lot of intervention work, working on the child abuse and neglect side of things, working with court-ordered domestic violence perpetrators for a long time in the past. And in the last 5 or 6 years, getting the opportunity to do more work with prevention, particularly with an early intervention with home visitors. And so it's really nice for me to be here in Arizona, giving this talk here today in the workshop afterwards about domestic violence intersection with home visiting, and particularly you'll hear about the connection with fatherhood that I'm going to talk about. I want to thank, before I get started, Arizona Department of Health Services, Bureau of Women's and Child's Health, obviously Irene. I want to thank Ellie Neerstedt for inviting me to be here and to talk and have this opportunity, and also Prevent Child Abuse Arizona for their role in this, and also the Strong Families Alliance. I was told Arizona was a dry heat. I'm just saying that, but let's get that out of the way right now. I was told Arizona was a dry heat. And as things kind of built up yesterday, I flew in yesterday, I got furious texts saying 1 in 100 years of rain, 1 in 100 years of flooding. Oh, look at this picture of I-10 with the floating cars. So I just wanted to get that out of the way because it's not a dry heat right now at all. We're going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to talk about domestic violence and the connection with home visiting. I'm going to talk about responsible fatherhood. I'm going to come back around to domestic violence and hopefully end with a little bit about recommendations for home visitors around this issue. And unfortunately, many people in this room are experienced with this issue. Too many from a personal angle. Many are experiencing this issue from working with families that have experienced domestic violence. And I just want to acknowledge those folks and just sort of know this is often an issue that cuts close to the bone for many people. It's amazing the disclosures, as I've worked in the human services field over the years, amazing the disclosures I've gotten around this issue. I also, I'm not the kind of person when he presents that often brings current events into the presentation, to be honest, because oftentimes there's so much in the news about domestic violence, and there's often so much on any given day about domestic violence that's not in the news, if you understand what I'm saying, that most of it goes unidentified, most of it goes unreported. It's one of the largest social issues. It affects families, it affects children, it affects outcomes for kids. It affects unborn children, young children. We know that when we're looking at kids at latency age, like 6 or 7 years old, we have data that says domestic violence in their lives is one of the most correlated things with behavioral and other issues. So there's a really tight connection between domestic violence and the safety and well-being of kids. And so I often don't bring in public health, current events, because there's so much going on around this. I went to the Arizona Cardinals game last night, so I've got football on the brain. I'm not a big sports person. I'm not going to tell you who I rooted for because there's probably Chargers fans in the audience as well. I was sitting with a Chargers fan yesterday, and she was not happy at the end of the game. But I do want to bring up the issue that I'm sure most of you have seen because it's on TV ad nauseum about Ray Rice and Janae. And if you're not familiar, really briefly, he's a Ravens football player, just got released 8-9 months after he assaulted her, and it came out and he punched her out. And he was seen dragging her on video, the earlier video, dragging her out of the elevator unconscious. And then yesterday came out the video of him actually hitting her. And so I'm not going to rehash this, but I want to ask you something. He's a father. They have a 1-year-old daughter together. And so what I want you to think about is the backdrop to this whole presentation is, how would you talk to Ray Rice about being a dad at this point? How would you engage him about his actions and what they relate to his role as being a father? He's not just putting Janae through this, he's putting his daughter through this. This is part of her history today, going forward. What's reasonable for us to expect from him as what he should have been thinking about, what he should be thinking about now, what he should be taking responsibility for? So imagine yourself as a home visitor going into the home of that 1-year-old. And how would you engage Ray Rice about being a dad? And what kind of relationship would you want to have with him as a home visitor? And how would you do it in a way where you directly addressed his violence and what it means for his family, for his wife as his partner and the mother of his child, and also for the child directly? What are the implications? And how would you do that in a way without demonizing him and throwing him away? Because I think as soon as I mention this, some of you would say, well, I wouldn't want to talk to him. He should have nothing to do. Look at the horrible thing. He's a monster. And I think one of the challenges we have is how do we really hold domestic violence perpetrators 100% responsible for their actions, and particularly their implications for their children, without turning them into monsters? How do we engage? I'll talk a little bit about this struggle. How do you really hold that balance, hold that line? Because if you want to think about it, not only might he need that right now, but if Janae's experience is anything like the experience of the families I've worked with, she needs somebody in there supporting her, and hopefully she has that, supporting her not only about her safety, her well-being, the trauma, but also how she sorts out her relationship, her love, her feelings for the father of her child, and doing it in a way that's non-judgmental. And unfortunately, what we're seeing in the news is not only the reaction to Ray Rice, but the reaction to her. And with that has come a tremendous amount of judgment. Why did she marry him after the assault? Why did she do this? It's none of our business to judge her decisions. One of our first jobs, are we being clear that he's 100% responsible for his behavior, period? And are we talking about it, and are we interacting? So if you were working with that family, would you be able to go in and really work with him and talk to him and talk about that, where you were clear that he was 100% responsible for what he did? Doesn't matter what she said the moment before that. Doesn't matter if she was cheating on him. Doesn't matter. I mean, I'm not saying I know any of this stuff, but doesn't matter these things that often get thrown in our direction, or we get thrown in families. Well, she was doing drugs, or she was doing this, and the story gets painted that somehow something she did justified the violence that came at her. And part of the good work we need to do around domestic violence, whether we're talking to domestic violence survivors, or talking to fathers who have been abusive, whether we're talking to kids when they're appropriate age, when we're teaching them, is this idea that people who perpetrate violence in the home are 100% responsible for their choice, or their choices and their behavior, and they're responsible for the consequences it creates, particularly for their children. And so I'm giving it to you as a backdrop to this conversation. And I was told there was a cue button here. Let's see if this works. Goes on here. There we go. I'm I'm not going to give you almost any background on our work right now. I want to be really kind of focused and move forward. And this talk is going to be at the intersection of these three things: domestic violence, maternal and child health, and responsible fatherhood. And I'm going to ask you to think about not only the work that needs to be done around perpetrators of violence who are fathers, but also how we bring that into our work with mothers. I was talking with Irene and Janet at the table beforehand and saying that in Connecticut, where we're based, we've been doing work with fathering home visitors. Connecticut has both what they call traditional home visitors who work with mothers and also fathering home visitors. And those home visitors work with the dads. And it was great to see the dads in the videos, too, those videos earlier. And what we found out of that work, just a little bit about it, is even if you don't work with the fathers, it's useful to think about the importance fathers have in families and the influence they have. So one of the first takeaways I want to offer you is that whether you're working with dads or not, whether there's domestic violence in the family or not, fathers matter. And when I say fathers matter or fathers are important, it means good, bad, or indifferent, fathers make a difference. One of the examples I give, and again, I'm going to give you a bunch of examples. We can't do a lot of interaction given there's 700 people in the room. But given that, I want to give you examples that you can really think about. And what I often do with folks who are working with older kids, I'll say to them, think of a family where you have a kid who's in therapy or medication. Then think about whether you could answer this question. Do you know if the father in the family, whether it's a biological father, whether it's a boyfriend, a social father, or a stepdad, could you tell me right now, without checking your notes, without going back and re-interviewing anybody, could you tell me if that father is negative, neutral, or supportive of the kid being on medication? And I'm not asking you to have an opinion about where he's at, but do you know what his opinion is about the medication or the therapy? So the translation here, as I was watching, I was thinking about that one of those families and the toys, and she said, well, the kid's really good at sort of taking the toys out of the box. We're going to work on putting the toys back in. So one of the simple questions is, with that family, would we know where the father is on that next developmental task for that kid, and whether he is supportive, he's positive, thinks it's a good idea, he's neutral, he's not involved, he's not influential, or he's negative about it. And you can all run through statements around this, which is the negative statement could be, oh, what's the big deal? He's a boy, he's messy, let him leave his stuff out. So what does it matter if you never work with the father but only the mother, if that's going on behind the scenes when you're not there in the home? How is that going to show up in your work with the mother? Is she going to tell you when he's negative or undercutting her, undermining her? Or on the flip side, is she going to tell you when he's positively involved and he's being supportive? So one of the questions, so the statement is, fathers matter, they're important, they're influential. The recommendation or the thought about that is what difference does it make to your work with the mom if you know that or don't know that? How does that shift your work? So we're going to be talking about this intersection of the responsible fatherhood, domestic violence, maternal and child health. You're going to see a few slides as I kind of move through them and not really talk about them, so you get a sense of the scope that we're working in. Irene sort of mentioned that we work internationally and across the country. But I wanted to show you this because it gives you important information. When we're talking about domestic violence and the intersection of children and particularly perinatal period, and one of the great things about home visiting programs is often their ability to target first-time parents, at-risk parents, parents before the child is born, and establish that relationship, and then work with them through a period of time. And I love that about home visiting programs. They really come into the home, meet families where they are, and you are right there sort of where the family is and meeting their needs in a tremendous way, supporting them in a tremendous way. And many of these families that you're working with have domestic violence as an issue in some way or another. If you look at that one stat in the middle, which talks about one home visiting program mothers revealed reporting intimate partner violence, is what IPV stands for, since the birth of their child. What we have on the child abuse and neglect caseload is an overlap between physical maltreatment of kids and domestic violence, estimated between 30 and 60%. And so one of the things that you might want to be doing right now, as you're sitting, is running through your mind about how many cases, how many families that I know about on my caseload have domestic violence that I'm aware of. And if there's domestic violence that I'm not aware of, and I'm going to just, for just simplicity's sake, when I say the word domestic violence, I'm talking about a whole range of behaviors that include physical violence, threats, intimidation, emotional control. Oftentimes it's not going to come out to you or be brought to you as a black eye, but it's going to be brought out to you. It is, oh, he needs to come or be here in the home every time you're here. He just likes it like that. And we were working with one home visitor, and she said, this was her story about it. She said, oh, I'm working with this family, and the father of child to be is very abusive, she said. And he's very controlling, and he shows up at every prenatal visit. And think about that for a second. What would be your first reaction to father showing up at every prenatal visit? You may feel very positive. This is a very involved father. This is wonderful. And if your reaction to her is, oh my God, isn't it so great that your husband or your boyfriend's coming to this visit? We get so few fathers who come. And she's standing there looking at you going, if only you knew. Because he's here to make sure I don't disclose anything to you and don't talk about anything that's going on in the home, and to monitor our conversation. And just think about, I'm going to talk about gender double standards in a second, and how we give credit to men for things that maybe they don't deserve as much credit for, and I'm going to explain that in a moment. And so this particular home visitor said, she said, I developed rapport and trust with this father to be enough that when a time came he couldn't go to the prenatal visit because of something else, he let me take her. But he said, you've got to bring her back in X time. And this home visitor said, I ran red lights to make sure that I could get her there and back in time, because I knew this time with her was precious, and developing this rapport with him so I could continue to get access was really critical to her safety. And she used that half-hour drive or whatever it was to talk about safety planning, to discuss what this woman needed, and to really help build in some supports for her. But this was a case that would present as a dad really showing up and being very involved. But what you really got was what you're seeing, the symptoms of control. So remember, when I use the word domestic violence, I'm really talking about this whole range of behaviors. Many of them are going to show up as non-physical abuse, non-arrestable behavior. Most of what we consider domestic violence is not arrestable. What you saw, again, and I'll use the Ray Rice example, what you saw in the elevator is likely to be a tip of the iceberg. A tip of the iceberg. And if you can imagine the emotional abuse or the control or the blame, this is your fault, I wouldn't have done it, you caused me to lose my job. I mean, that's a very common thing. Again, I'm sort of using this current events, but that's very common. If somebody perpetrates violence, gets arrested and loses their job, you caused me to lose my job because you got me arrested. And that's part of the pattern as well. And so for home visitors, this is one of the challenges that involved fathers. It may be an indicator of control because they may not want you to meet with this person alone. There are different ways to sort that out. And so domestic violence is often a context for home visiting. And that home visitors report themselves that they often felt not competent to deal with that. And that's really important. That's part of the reason why we're talking about this today. And that the new federal mandates really expect domestic violence to be dealt with. And if you look at the practice recommendations at the bottom of the slide, training and supervisory support for home visitors, self-care and values clarification, and engaging men and fathers. When you walk away from today's talk, 1 hour, an hour and a half on domestic violence is not enough training around this issue. And training isn't enough. You need to look at your agency's supervisory practices, screening tools, questions about how we ask and identify it, what do we do when we find it, and then how do we really look at this in the context of fathers. And what I want to say is that, I'm going to move away from the mic because I'm going to do a couple things, high-tech visual aids in a moment. What I want to say is that when I talk about domestic violence, I speak from a perspective where I know that both men and women can be violent. Both men and women can be controlling. And that domestic violence is an issue that cuts across socioeconomic strata, across different groups, happens in heterosexual relationships, same-sex couples, and it knows no limitations or sort of boundaries. And in fact, some of the most difficult, scary cases can be when you have a very affluent and powerful domestic violence perpetrator with a lot of resources at their disposal, and attorneys and other folks, and really different ways to sort of control not only the other person, but systems. And so I really want to be clear that I understand that both men and women can be violent, and men and women can be controlling. For the purposes of this talk and many of the other talks that I give, I'm going to talk about male perpetrators and female victims for a couple of reasons. One is it's the most common scenario you're going to deal with. Second is, and this is important, we know that even though both men and women can get arrested for violence, that men are causing injuries and harm to women at rates that are estimated being 7 times greater. And if you use that as a proxy for fear and control, we just know that when men's violence happens, that's often more physically damaging, and it's often more embedded in a pattern of coercive control, those controlling other things I talked about earlier. So really to understand that if you're working with a family where both people have been arrested, or both people have been saying, well, they're both violent, or somebody says to you, well, they both have issues and they fight all the time, stop, slow down, and really think about what's going on. Are both people equally afraid? Have both people been equally injured? Are both people being equally controlling? Who can leave the relationship safely without danger of being harmed? Whose life is getting smaller? One of the best things that I've learned from working with domestic violence survivors and working with their advocates is when you talk about this issue, you can ask yourself, whose life is getting smaller? And this is one of the ways that you can really think about the intersection of domestic violence and kids. Worked on a case where the family lived across the street from a playground, really directly across the street, and there was young kids in the family, and the father of the children was very controlling, very abusive. The kind of thing where when they went out, he didn't want her to look at other people. If other men looked at her, he accused her of eliciting it. And even when he wasn't there physically, he would grill her when he went out, when he wasn't there and she went out. He would ask her all sorts of questions about where were you, what did you do, who did you see, who did you talk to. And by the way, one of the most common things that kids are used in terms of this is when they're old enough to use as spies. When you get kids are old enough, one of the ways domestic violence perpetrators use kids is by using them as spies, pumping them for information. What did you do today? You ask a 4-year-old, right, what they did today, what are you going to get? You get a long string of activities and stuff that happen. Kid's not going to know that they're being pumped for information. And so one of the examples that I want to give about sort of when we look at this is that that in this situation, as he became more jealous, he became more controlling, his accusations became stronger, he just exhausted her. I'm not sure if I'm doing this or this is something else that's happening. She became exhausted. And so what you saw happen, even though this was not his intent, is guess what? She stopped taking the kids to the playground across the street. He was trying to control her access to other men, control her as a human being, but in the process of doing that, making her life smaller, guess whose life got smaller? The kid's life got smaller. So I really want you to think about how important it is to see this when we're using this term, look at domestic violence in kids, how we're seeing the connection. And so when I talk about this issue, I talk through the lens of the most common thing. I talk through the lens of that violence is not equal, who's getting smaller, who's being hurt, who's being injured. And so I want you to ask those questions if you're being presented with a situation where both people are telling you or you're being told both are equally violent, because that's rarely the case. And then the last reason why I talk about male perpetrators of domestic violence and female victims is we have a highly gendered system, in my view. And what I mean by that is we have different set of expectations for mothers and fathers. So I'm going to try this out on you to see if this is true here with the populations you work with. If you go into a home and are asking if kids are medically up to date, who do you generally ask, mothers or fathers? Fathers, right? If you're looking at kids to get to counseling or to get involved with some sort of services like that, who do you expect to keep the kids or get the kids to counseling? Mothers, right? If you're a kid who's got a dirty face or has ripped jeans, who do you think didn't do their job? What's your first reaction, right? And so when you start running through all these different things, if we talk about kids that don't have stable housing and don't have a roof over their heads, who do we start talking about didn't do their job, doesn't keep the kids in stable housing? Oh, we got some dad stuff going on there. Because we're talking, I heard you guys over there. I could hear it was coming from that table over there, just so you know. I'm going to take my jacket off because it's warm up here. And so one of the things I want you to think about is that if we have a highly gendered system, how that makes a difference. So one of the things I want you to think about is in your communities where there's an agency that's got the word children and families in it, does it serve children and families or does it serve women and children? So women and children. You guys keep talking. That's good. I like that. It serves women and children. And so one of the things that's happened, and I'm going to go to the next slide here. Maybe I went too far with that. Is that what we do is we have one set of expectations for moms, one expectation for dads, and I'm going to give you this high-tech visual aid to kind of show you something. So you don't, I know I put the slide up and you're looking at the slide, now you should look at me because this is a high-tech visual aid and you're all going to be able to see it. Don't go looking around anywhere else for something. Okay, this is it. It was years in development. I go back to places and people ask me, do that thing with your hands again at this point. And so what I'm going to do is this could be a little bit of a quiz. This hand represents our cultural expectations of mothers. This hand over here, you get one answer. That's it. This is our cultural expectations of fathers. Now, this doesn't mean that all women are great mothers. There's a lot of women out there who are not great mothers, and there are a lot of men out there who are great fathers. But our practice, our approach to families, the way we think about families, in my experience, is so highly gendered that it really influences our ability to help families around domestic violence. Help them around a lot of issues, but really address domestic violence. Because if domestic violence perpetrators are fathers, many of them, or father figures, how do we hold them accountable for what they're doing to their kids if our standards for dads are so low? And so if you go back to those questions I asked you before, when we got to sort of dads or housing, we got to a money issue, right? So oftentimes, if you've got a father in a family who's working 80 hours a week and he's not doing drugs and he's coming home and he's not cheating and he's not running around on the streets, how do we think about him as a parent? Would we think that he's doing the basic things we'd expect him to do? Now, if you think about what it's like to be a woman working 30, 40 hours a week, the one woman out there on the video talked about being outside the home and her challenge, which is what most women talk about, is once you're working part-time or even full-time, you feel guilty because you're not doing your job. You feel like you're not doing what you need to do by your kids. This plays out day in and day in about how we talk to and approach families and talk to them about things like domestic violence. So one of the questions you can ask is, do you know if women on your caseload right now would say, yes, my partner respects me as a parent, and this is what he does to show me respect as a parent? Would you know that about her life? Would you know what he does, her partner does to support her as a parent? Now, some folks are going to say, well, there's not a father there. So the question is the father living someplace else? I'm including fathers living down the street. I'm including fathers who may be incarcerated. Because for sure, and I'm going to keep doing this, by the way. You have noticed I haven't stopped doing this? Because I really do want you to remember, when you leave here, think about this gender double standard. Think about why we haven't been talking about Ray Rice as a parent. We've been talking about as a breadwinner. We're talking about as a football player. We've been talking about him as a spouse. But I don't think anybody's talked about him as a parent. And why is that? If you think about one of the largest betrayals he did, not just of his wife, but he just betrayed his child and his fathering role. And we're not talking about that. And so I'm willing to stand up here for a few more minutes like this, so when you leave, next time you see a story about Ray Rice today on the radio, because you're going to hear about it later, then you'll be thinking about, wow, there's nothing we're thinking about him as a dad, and what's that like for his wife, for Janae, because maybe she's staying or doing all the things she's doing for the child. How much is that her daughter, whose name is Raven, I think, right? How much is she doing for Raven? And that's not part of the equation. And so what we're doing here, so we want to think about this. So I'm going to put this down for a second. I'll give you an example of how this came up. I was standing outside a coffee shop, and I was reading the paper, and there's two women on the other side of the front door, deep in this conversation about whatever. And there was this man, it was Saturday morning, he was coming across the parking lot, and he was holding an infant in his arm, and he's walking with a toddler. And as he got close to the front door, the women stopped dead from their very animated conversation and started cooing over him. And in cooing over them, they made all sorts of stuff up, right? Your wife must be so lucky. So they assumed he was straight. They assumed he was married. Your wife must be so lucky. Isn't it wonderful? Look at you. Isn't this great? Oh, you're so sweet. Look at, you're letting her sleep. I mean, they created this whole story. And this poor guy looked like, sort of like, well, I'm just going to get my coffee. Could I just kind of keep going to get my coffee? And what ended up happening is he walked past and they went back to their conversation right away. And I stopped and I've tested this out and asked people about this, which was, if that was a woman walking across a parking lot, what would have been different? Right. Either they wouldn't noticed, or, and I'm feeding back what I've gotten from audiences, which is they might have criticized the way she was holding the baby, how she was dressed. I wouldn't go out in sweatpants like that. How could she do that? Why isn't she wearing makeup? And unfortunately, I'm getting a lot of laughter in here that there's some identification for this. And so bringing it down to this level about double standards, and we're going to come back around to domestic violence in a moment, how do you hold somebody accountable when guys get so much credit? And what I say with folks is, when I work in sort of visitation issues, if a guy can walk across the visitation room floor, cradling the baby's head in his arms, and not drop the baby, he's a great dad. Do you see the way he's cradling that baby's neck? Look at that, how he knows to cradle that baby's neck. He didn't drop the baby. He's still breathing. And so what you've got here is this idea that when I've talked to social workers who are doing like child welfare work and doing supervised visitation, they will, if they're being honest with you, they'll say, just the fact he makes all his appointments on time, we kind of consider him a great dad. Just by showing up. And what this means is, in family court, we believe that when domestic violence perpetrators go to family court and insist they have rights to their kids and they want to see their kids, when they're doing it to control their partner, judges and courts respond very positively to that. Because you have a dad showing up acting like his kids are important. Even if he's actually using the kids as a weapon against her, well, he's not going to lose. I'm going to make sure I get my rights. I'm not going to lose. So it's not about the kids. The courts respond, and they're often giving unsupervised, almost always going unsupervised access to domestic violence perpetrators. And actually, they're winning custody. There's studies that talk about them winning custody at a higher rate than dads who aren't violent, if you can believe that. So one of the things I want you to do is really think about what this means. And if you look at this chart, when you have the invisible dad, we don't see him, doesn't matter, he's not in the home. Even if he's around all the time, we don't see him, they're not together as a couple, we might think we ignore him. The good guy is the guy who can walk across the visitation room floor, not drop the baby, and we welcome him, we reward him. That's amazing, look at you, that's great. The bad guy is the guy who's got a history of violence somewhere in his past. It could be 10 years ago, drug charges, gang involvement, He could have addiction issues. And we summarily dismissed those guys. Good riddance. And this is one of the places that we're trying to fix. We're really approached, this has fallen more heavily on poor men, men of color. And it's really been a way that we basically sort of said, guys don't matter. And in fact, that's why I said to you earlier about Ray Rice. Imagine engaging him about being a dad without throwing him away. He is still that baby's father. He's going to be that baby's father her entire life. If you got to ask that child, she'd probably say, please help my dad be a better man. Please help my dad treat my mother better, right? Don't you think that's the most likeliest thing she'd be saying at this point? And she wouldn't be saying throw him in jail and lock up the key, but make us safer. Make my mother safer. And so this balancing act is not easy, but it's really important to understand that we do nothing. It means when we hold him invisible, we do nothing with him. When he's a good guy, we do no assessment. Reporting that this guy can walk across the visitation room floor without dropping the baby is not a parental assessment. Let me be clear about that, okay? And I'll tie this into domestic violence. I was working on a case where I was doing training for a smaller group of social workers than you guys. It was about 40 people. And it was child welfare. And the worker and the supervisor raised their hand and said, we've got this case to talk to you about, and mom's really difficult to deal with. It's a domestic violence case. The father had been violent to the mother, but they're not together as a couple anymore. And mom's really difficult to deal with, and we want to talk about it. And he's got primary custody of the child, and the child is an 8-year-old boy. He lives with dad 4 days a week and lives with mom 3 days a week. Now, if you know anything about domestic violence, and just think about this, he's been violent to mom, and now he's got primary control of the kid. Kid lives with him more than lives with the mother. But they wanted to talk about the mom, not the dad. And I said, before we talk to the mom, about the mom, can I just ask you a couple basic questions? So you have a violent parent who's got unsupervised access to his 8-year-old son 4 days a week. What's been your parenting assessment of him? And the response I got back was, mom's really difficult to deal with. And I said, that's fine. We'll come back to mom and your challenges with her. I'm sure they're real. I'm sure you need to deal with it. But can you just help allay my concerns around the safety of this 8-year-old boy? This 8-year-old boy is with a parent who we know has a history of violence. This is not theoretical. This is not an assessment for the potential for violence. This is a person who's been violent. He's been with him. What's been your assessment of his parenting? The response I got back was, mom's really difficult to deal with. I asked that one more time, and I got the same response. And then finally they said, we'll need to do a consultation with you. And guess what we found out, or what I found out as we met, which is that this father had been using this child as a weapon against mom. He'd been saying that mom's stealing from me, taking my keys, taking my money. In front of the social worker, the 8-year-old boy saw mom's new keys. So mom had changed her phone number and her keys to protect herself from this guy and his harassment and his access to her. Stuff we would always ask people to do. And so he was training this boy to be a little smart bomb, a little smart weapon. And so the kids saw the keys, and in front of the social worker said, oh, those are the keys that dad said you stole from him. And so one of the takeaways I want you to have with that is domestic violence perpetrators don't necessarily stop being influential in families when they're no longer living in the home. So one of the things to ask yourself is, how many clients do I have? How many moms am I working with where the father of their child has been violent, has been abusive? You know that, and he's no longer in the home, but he's still influential. She's worried he's going to come by. He comes by. She's worried about visitation. She's with a new boyfriend, and she's worried he's going to come by and harass and attack the new boyfriend. How much does she try to navigate him not finding out about things that are going on in her life or the life of the child? And so here's a case where the father wasn't in the home, and she was still worried. And so the last little bit, and it goes back to this, by the way, it goes back to this double standard, because I find this very useful. And I didn't do any yoga this morning, so this becomes part of what I get to do this morning. I get to do in front of you. Is that this mother couldn't give her 8-year-old son her own cell phone, her new cell phone number. So given what I told you about the father, why do you think that is? because he trained the kid to give up the cell phone number. Now, if you had no context of his pattern of behavior, what would be your first reaction to hearing a mother, you're talking to an 8-year-old kid who says, "Oh, I don't know mommy's cell phone number"? What would be your first judgment of her? What was that? She doesn't care, she has attachment issues, what's wrong, she's selfish, how could you have a kid who can't reach her in an emergency? Without the context of the domestic violence and without looking at him as a parent, even though he's not living in a home, you're more likely to blame her for the things that he's doing to the family functioning to the kids, even if he's not in the room. So think about all these times when you're doing home visits with somebody you know is a domestic violence history where the father of the kid has been violent, or maybe a boyfriend. Imagine how he's still influential even if he's not in the room. And start thinking about, how do I talk to her about that? How do I talk to her about how she's navigating decisions? I've worked with many, many women who have an open child welfare case or a new investigation, maybe because of drug abuse or something else that's going on, and are panicked that child welfare is going to call their abusive ex-partner who's going to use this information as a way to take the kids away from her. That's him still being influential. There was a study done of men in prison. Actually, it was a study of women who had recanted on domestic violence charges, 16 of them, very small study. And they looked at the jailhouse tapes, and they could review them after the fact of these women. And what they got were phone calls. Which was much less threatening than you thought there would be. People thought, well, that he's threatening her to get her to recant. What they were doing was using the children as a mechanism of control. That the theme that came out over and over again in these 16 tapes was, do you know what's going to happen to me? Do you know how long I'm going to go to jail for? Is this what you wanted for the father of your children? Do you know what it's going to do to your kids, our kids, for me to be in jail like this? And each of the guys in there exert tremendous guilt using the kids as a fulcrum, as a lever, to get her to change her story. And so again, when you're thinking about the families you're working about, the intersection with domestic violence, don't just think about the couples where they're still together as a couple, but think about the families where he may not be around anymore, but may still be influential. And is that a factor in the work that you're doing with the family? I've touched upon this already, but I want you to see these slides real briefly. This is really about the idea that when we make fathers invisible, when we don't know anything about his role. And so one of the most basic questions you could be asking if you're working with a mom is, describe to me the way your partner demonstrates respect for you as a parent. So think about what might shift if you're not doing this already. Many of you are doing this already. As part of your engagement with a family is, do you say to somebody, I want to understand how your family's functioning a little bit more. Can you tell me a little bit about what kind of things, since you seem to be the primary caregiver, what kind of things your partner does to support you as a parent or to show you respect as a parent? And if they come back and say, well, he really loves me and really loves the kids, say that's really important and that's great that he loves you and loves the kids. What I'm actually asking you to describe to me is the behaviors he engages, the things he does and says that show you and show other people, if you have other kids already, that he respects you as a parent. And see what you get back from that simple question. And part of what you're going to find out is it's a great gateway question in some circumstances to finding out about domestic violence and to issues of control, okay? That oftentimes, we've all learned that the worst way to ask or screen for domestic violence is to go in the house and say, is there any domestic violence here? Doing it with his mother there in the room, by the way. That's a bad way. We also know that screening and asking for domestic violence with kids over the age of 2 in the room is not good practice either. Because if you have somebody who's working very hard to either not let the kids be put in the middle, be used as spies, also that I've worked to protect my kids from knowing about certain things, to ask me about it when I've worked hard for not to expose my kids to it, to try to keep them away from it, is really setting me up to lie to you. So when you're talking about asking questions, that these kind of conversations can really be eye-opening. I'll give you another example of how these most simplest, we often think about assessment as questions you ask versus what you're listening for. And so many of you know this already, but I'm thinking about an example of, and we knew there was domestic violence in this family already, but the mother didn't want to talk about it anymore. So we kind of backed off that conversation. The social worker went into the home, and I think there were at least 3 or 4 kids in this household, different ages, and the household was immaculate. And so the social worker is one of those households where the mother asks you to take the shoes off when you go inside so you can, so you don't get it dirty, and the social worker was very cognizant of that. And she started commenting on, boy, this has got to be a lot of work to keep the house this clean. With these many kids, this must be really hard. So she's just giving very normal validation and praise and observation back to her. And the response she got back from this was, well, that's the way he likes it. And I think, again, when you're listening for that, that doesn't mean it's a violent relationship. That doesn't mean it's a bad relationship. I want you to hear that sometimes people have all sorts of arrangements. Well, I do this for you, you do this for me. If it's equal or if it's mutual, it can work for lots of people. The next question, what will he do if you can't get this clean, is the question that gives you the information that you want. What happens if we spend time together and you couldn't pick up the kid's toys before he got home? How would he act? How would he be? How understanding would he be about that? And so these kind of questions is really asking questions about the patterns of coercive control that may be present in the family and what may be going on in terms of this. And if somebody says to you, well, nothing's going on, oh, it's not like that, my last boyfriend, he was really violent, but Joe's a really good guy, then one of the things that you can really say to them is say, that's fine, I'm really glad this relationship's better than your last one. I just want to let you know if ever something happened where he was threatening you or trying to control you or was calling you names, that there's a lot of stuff that can be very hurtful to the functioning of the kids, to your functioning, that I want to talk to you and help you if that's going on. And what we know is when people kind of offer that non-judgmental bridge to somebody, they're much more likely to step onto it at some point because they're not just afraid if they come out and talk about the domestic violence that they're going to get hurt. They're going to think that you're judging them, particularly around the kids, because guess what? They're walking around with the guilt for what the kids are going through. And that they're worried that you're going to look at them as a bad mother. And until we really see that Ray Rice is a parent making a choice when he punches out his wife, that's a parenting choice. What we're watching on the news, what you're going to see again, because they're running that tape over and over again, I want you to see it and think about it as a parenting choice. Just like we think about the guy who keeps his girlfriend or his wife up all night, grilling her, asking her questions. Who are you with? Who are you sleeping with? He leaves, he goes out to the other room, he comes back a couple, half hour later, wakes her up again, exhausts her. And in that point, he's not thinking about at 6 a.m. she's got to get up with the baby and get the baby and her out of the house and get the baby to daycare and get herself to work. He's thinking about whom? He's thinking about himself. He's thinking about his fears, what he thinks should be happening. And so what happened, when you see that video of Ray Rice, think about what he wasn't thinking about in that moment, which is what his responsibility was to Raven, what his responsibility was to Janae, obviously, and really how would you engage him around this and hold him 100% responsible as a parent for what he did. And that's part of the way when you start shifting these conversations and you make it look a little bit more like this. I'm particularly wanting you to sort of talk about, how do you set high standards for dads? That we have to include that how they treat their kid's mother is a part of the definition of being a good dad. I've come to the place where we have to be willing to be explicit that when we define a good dad, it's not just how well are you playing with the kids, not just are you supporting the family financially, but it has to include whether the couple stays together. The data is pretty supportive of this, that it really have to look at how well does he treat his partner and the mother of his kids. And so for those of you who are working with moms, how does that come into the conversation? How do you bring that into the conversation? How do you talk to her and give her the language and say, you know what, when he's doing that to you, he's making a parenting choice. We had a great experience. We were doing work with domestic violence advocates in Florida. We were doing training in the Safe and Together model around them, and I'm giving you kind of bits and pieces of the model as I'm talking. And as we were doing training with them, one of the advocates went back and did a group for women who were involved with child welfare. And as you can imagine, these women they were domestic violence victims and felt very guilty about what was happening to their kids. They felt bad about themselves as mothers. And so the first go-around in group, the first check-in group, they were asked to just check in and talk about their experience. And all of them were really unhappy, talked about their guilt and their shame, how they were bad moms. And so they did another round of check-in and said, well, now I want you to talk about what kind of choices your partner made as a parent. Insert, again, Ray Rice as a parent, just to kind of make it very, very immediate. And as they went around the room, they said the affect, the mood for the women changed completely, because as they were told that his violence to her was a parenting choice and that he was responsible as a parent for that decision, guess what happened? What the facilitator got to see was something that looked more like this. Because there were higher expectations of him, and the higher expectations not only changed how we might work with him, but they changed how we talked to her. So one of the things you can experiment with, if you've got clients on your caseload who you know are domestic violence victims, to really start talking about, just really want to be clear with you that just his violence to you, his abuse to you, is a parenting choice he's making. And if people are living in the world like most of us are, which is low expectations for fathers, they may never have had anybody ever say that to them. And that doesn't mean he's a demon, doesn't mean he's a monster, doesn't mean she has to leave him, doesn't mean that he should be arrested, doesn't mean any of those things are automatic. It just means that you're talking to her about that he's just as responsible as a parent for his decisions that he's making. One of the things that I often point out to folks is when we look at domestic violence and sort of how this double standard gets played out in our system day in and day out, is if you think about a domestic violence perpetrator who gets arrested, and he's living in a house, he's living with his partner and their 2 kids, maybe the youngest kid is theirs, maybe the older kid is from another relationship, and he's contributing some money to the financial support, and maybe he's picking up the kids after they get dropped off from school and watching them a couple hours a day so she can stay at her job a little bit longer. So maybe he's not doing most of the child care, maybe he's not contributing a lot of money, but we all know that for families living on the edge, that little bit makes a huge difference. Makes a difference in the size of the apartment, makes a difference whether you can keep a job or not. And so he chooses to get violent. And I want to say if he chooses to get violent, even if the kids aren't in the room or aren't even present, that's still a parenting choice, because it's reasonable for us to expect him to know and think about what that would do to harm the kids. The kids will see her with a black eye, she may not be able to function, he might be, if he's doing it from the kids, he may be degrading their respect for her. So he gets violent with her, and he gets arrested. And in many places, he gets put out of the house on an order of protection. So if you think about that scenario, he's living in the house, he's contributing in some ways, and now he's out of the house. So one is, did his personality change? If he was controlling over there, did he automatically become not controlling over here? So that's just one thing to really keep in mind. And now that he's living outside the house, did he become less responsible as a parent? Well, legally, he's just as responsible for his child as he was when he was living in the home. Now, the mother's over here, and guess what's happened? Because he made a parenting choice or a choice to get violent, she's now got to deal with all the child care herself. She's got to deal with possibly going to court and doing those things. She may have less money, so now she's worried about eviction. She may be worried about not being able to make the mortgage. And so guess what happens over here? She shows up at court on the next day or Monday or 2 days later and does what? Recants. Didn't happen. It wasn't a big deal. Now think about how these are connected. Dad's over here, his child's over there. He's been held accountable by the system. Shouldn't get too close to the speaker. He's held accountable by the system. What I mean by accountable, he was arrested and he was put out of the house in order of protection. But in most places that I work, nobody's telling him at the time of arrest, you've got to keep paying child support. Nobody's telling him that you've got to give back the car, because when he was living in the house, guess what? How many cars they had? 1. And guess where the car went when he moved out? Car went with him. So now mom's life got more difficult. Now, if you met with this guy and you talked to him, you know what he would probably say? I'll do anything for my kids. I love my kids. I'll do anything for kids. And then if you made that tangible, you say, give her back her car, or give her back the family car so she can use the car to get the kids to the doctor, go to appointments, get to work so she doesn't lose the house. He'd say, no, it's my car. I need it to go and look for a job. So 1 second he's saying, I love my kids. I'll do anything for them. But when you ask him to do tangible something, this is what you might get back. Now, what I can tell you is, you want to ask in systems. I'm not saying home visitors. I'm talking about the system in general. The system should ask him. We should document. Because there's a group of guys who will say, okay, if you're asking me to do that, I will turn the car back over to her. But some of them won't do it unless they're asked. And this is going back to setting high standards. High standards means you approach this father over here and say, you're still a dad, by the way. Those are still your kids, or that's still your child. What are you willing to do? And if he says, well, I'm not going to pay her a penny until this court case goes away, the response would be from the system, so you're willing, not only did you choose to get violent to your kid's mother, but now you're willing to punish them because you got in trouble for doing what you chose to do. And you want to use your kids as a lever against her, the kids as a way to hurt her and control her, because you're saying, I'm not going to give her a penny until this court case goes away. So I want you to really kind of keep thinking about how we don't, because of this, really think through all the different ways we are not holding batterers, domestic violence perpetrators, accountable as parents. And that really we should hold them to the same, all I'm suggesting out of today's talk is hold them to the same set of expectations we hold women to. And that they're just as responsible for where their kids are living. They're just as responsible for whether kids are dirty or clean. They're just as responsible for whether kids get their medication or not. They're just as responsible whether kids go to therapy. I remember a guy I worked with on a case, 8-year-old kid, had all these problems, was depressed, was suicidal, had been hospitalized at 8 multiple times. And we know that part of it was because dad had a long history of violence. And a couple of things that kind of jump out at me about the case. One is, all he cared about was getting that kid off medication. He didn't care about his violence. He didn't care about his kid's situation. He just thought it was wrong that the doctors were giving his kids medication. And that's what he was fixated on. The other thing we learned, by the way, at some point from his older sister, the boy's older sister, was when he went to jail, he told the boy, be a bad son to mom to be a good son to dad. So I just want to really kind of bring in this idea about accountability. It really isn't about what's happening just when he's living in the home. We have to really include in this idea that when he's not living in the house, he's just as responsible. And how do we get in our communities, people start thinking about how do we support people being better dads? And how do we really think about what we're asking of men as parents when they get arrested? I mean, I remember this case where I talked to a child welfare worker, and they had a case where dad had gone violent, dad had been arrested, he'd been kicked out of the house on an order of protection. And they said, well, we went out and we met with the mother, we interviewed her, we went and met with the dad separately, we interviewed him. I said, that's great. And we had mom do a case plan. And I waited another few minutes, and the supervisor, I said to her, well, you had mom do a case plan, why didn't you have dad do a case plan? He's the biological father of the child or the children in the home. And her response was very telling. She said, he's involved with criminal court. So remember over here, criminal court doesn't do anything about fatherhood. So you had an agency that was focused on safety and well-being of kids, and their response was, we don't want to deal with him, we don't need to deal with him because it's gender double standard. And what they were saying is, well, they'll deal with him, and it's good enough to get him incarcerated, it's good enough to get him arrested. And part of the issue has been that we've looked at domestic violence through a lens of relationship. I'm going to jump over some slides here. I'm aware of the time. You know what's hard about 700 people is you don't get a lot of questions asked during the talk. Give me 1 second here. So I'm going to jump over a couple things. By the way, this is just as a little aside as I kind of move forward, that this is just some of the data that's there. And you'll have these slides will be available to you. They'll be put up on the website, by the way, so those of you kind of trying to keep track because they're not in your packet. This is some of the work that we know about the positive involvement men can have during perinatal period particularly. And if I have time, I've got a couple other stories about this that I can share with you. And when you get to this, these are just some questions we could be asking about dads in general. And one of my goals, by the way, just sort of as I'm kind of segueing into talk about perpetrators' patterns for a minute, one of my goals when I think about agencies that work with families is we start having as close as much information about dads' experiences of being a parent and their parenting that we do about moms. And we understand the differences, we understand the similarities. One of the things just really quickly to think about when you think about this work with dads is how do women find out they're going to be pregnant, and then how do men find out that they're going to be a parent? And what's different about those two different things? And who in a man's life knows that he's about to become a father, and how do they know that? Right? For women, it's the whole process about who do I tell, but showing. And at some point it becomes topic of conversation to people, even if you don't want them to talk to you about it. It's really obvious. But if you think about men going through pregnancy, and if the people don't know that person well and know her well, then guess what? He could go to work every day and nobody would know he's a father-to-be, unless he chooses to tell them. So that's these small differences of things when you start thinking about sort of how men go through, who does he go and talk to and get support? And so when we look at this issue about tying together good fathering with his respect for his partner, what you start getting is this idea that domestic violence is one of those things that obviously is very important when we look at the work of families. Because if he's being verbally abusive, if he's calling her names, if he's putting her down, if he's sexually assaulting her, if he's using money to control her, if he's keeping family away, if he's keeping friends away, if he's stopping her from working. I mean, I want to give you kind of this common example just for a second about we'll often refer to, we'll kind of say, well, this is stalking behavior, or this is, and we often won't even use it when the couple's still together. We don't often use that phrase stalking, but it is stalking. So if he's the kind of person who doesn't want her to work at a place or a job where there are other men, that what we have men doing very commonly is showing up early to pick her up from work, sitting outside and waiting for her, calling work over and over again, doing these things that make it really hard for her to keep her job, so at some point the employer says, this is too much trouble to keep you around, and they fire her. Just think about for a second about through the lens of a parent, what kind of parenting choice is that where you do things to actively get your partner fired from a job? And to really think about how you would talk to a mother about that who's been in that situation and how you help her understand that he was making a parenting choice. It wasn't just he was harassing her, which again is just as important, but we want to add in there, and on top of it, he did that without regard to what it would mean for the financial situation of the family and stability of the kids. And so when we start thinking about domestic violence, and I'm kind of showing you some of the slides that kind of format the basic part of the model that we do when we work with systems, that the idea how important it is to work towards keeping kids safe and together with that non-offending parent, that domestic violence victim, because they're often the person who's most engaged around the safety of the kids, most engaged around helping them heal from trauma. Many kids who are exposed to violence don't need to go to therapy. I don't want to kind of give you a blanket statement, but oftentimes the caring relationship with an adult, often the domestic violence victim, is enough to help them get through the trauma of the violence, and that often that victims are providing stability and nurturance that kids need. I was once sitting with a woman who was going through a family court situation where she was getting divorced from her partner, had been abusive, and she was coming to me for work-related things, actually. And we're sitting and talking about this model and going through different parts of this. And I said to her, you know, one of the pieces of the model is giving validation to victims for how hard they're working to keep their kids safe. Again, think about Janae and think about what people are saying about her right now. And I looked at this woman and said, so part of the model is giving you credit, because what happens is, in the mix of this stability and nurturing stuff, moms don't get credit for it because it's just what moms do. And we don't see the importance that when there's been violence, how much they're doing to provide those 3 meals a day, to provide those regular feedings. And so when I said this to her, I said, has anybody ever in the courts that you've been dealing with in the last couple of years ever said to you, looked at you and I said, I see how hard you're working to keep your kids safe? And this woman broke down crying in this coffee shop because nobody in 2 years had ever said that to her, had ever said, I see how hard you're working to keep your kids safe. And the only way you can easily get there is when you also have the ability to say, and his violence to you is a parenting choice. We had a case where the assault of this, the child was regularly breastfeeding, healthy child, normal breastfeeding routine. The assault happened around the time the breastfeeding was supposed to happen. I don't know if she's holding the baby at the time. I don't remember the details anymore about this case. But what we know is by the next day, the child had stopped breastfeeding. So we really had this connection directly with the trauma and the assault and the breastfeeding stopping. And so when we look at this in the right way, if you want to have conversations, we cannot blame that mother for the fact the child stopped breastfeeding. We would have to give 100% responsibility to that father who chose to assault her while she was holding the baby or while she was soon afterwards or during breastfeeding period, whatever the exact particulars of that were. And we want to hold him 100% responsible. All we're doing is saying he's just as responsible as a parent as she is. That's all we're saying. That's the radical message of that. And so as we're working with domestic violence, what you really have to kind of pull together this idea of how do we partner with domestic violence victims, how do we build a bridge to them, how do we talk to them about their safety in a non-judgmental, non-blaming way, how do we validate their strengths? Part of the way we partner with domestic violence is we see how hard they're working. One of the most common things that we've seen people do is judge women. And the example I give is somebody gets assaulted, and the next morning they get up and they get their kids ready and they go and stand in the school bus stop, and they're there with, this is kind of the stereotypical thing, with the long sleeves and the sunglasses, because either they have a black eye or they've got marks on their arms from being grabbed, and they don't want anybody to see it. And when other people find out about it, they go, what's wrong with her? She's acting like nothing happened. But when you stop and talk to her, what she said is, I wanted to get my kids off to school. I wanted them to have a normal routine. I wanted them to feel like everything was okay. So I acted as if everything was okay so they would be able to get off to school and get on with their day. Because what he's doing to me shouldn't affect them. I'm also thinking about the mom in a case where he came home drunk. Poor family, came home drunk, car was a gift from grandma. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, he demands the car to go out drinking again because he's out with a buddy, dropped him off. She says no, she says, we don't have any money, this is the car. And in fact, she's getting the child ready to go, the kid's in a car seat, she's getting ready to go out. And he starts hitting her. He's been drinking, he starts hitting her. He still hits her over here. Why? Because even though he's been drinking, he knows that it won't show. He's still making choices. So remember, he's drunk, wants to take the car, which is their only resource to get the kid to the doctor, or the main resource they've got to get the kid to the doctor and around. So again, think through a parenting lens. Think about all the ways you would measure him as a parent and talk to him. Because I'm not saying you wouldn't be able to talk to him about it or talk about it, but you have this thing which is he's going to take the car, he's going to drive drunk with the car, he possibly damage the car. She's about to go out with the child to do something else. So he starts assaulting her and hits her here. She picks up the baby in the car seat. So he's not caring where the child is when he's assaulting her. He picks up the car seat, moves it across the room, and then moves herself back in the other direction. Why? So he's not assaulting her. He's not interested in the baby. He's interested in hurting her. So she, in the middle of being assaulted, moves the child and then moves herself away. Where is that woman going to get credit for the fact that under assault, under fire, guess who she was thinking about? And where is he going to get held accountable? And when I say accountable, the beginning of accountability is seeing this and seeing him responsible as a parent. Where is it going to start? Who's going to say to him, you know what, we want to talk to you about the fact that you beat up your girlfriend, you assaulted her, and what you need to do to fix that and how you're going to change and make sure you not do that. But we also want to talk to you as a father about the choices you made and what you think the impact of what you did to her was for the child. And to ask him questions. What were your thoughts about the child as you went to assault her? What do you think the impact was? What do you think the danger was? And so even if you don't ever have this conversation in your role with fathers, I want you to have a map for it because it's going to help you do better work with mothers about their lives and their choices. Because what we find is what's happening is if people don't hold perpetrators 100% responsible, guess who they end up blaming? The mom. Why did you stay? Why didn't you leave? You make poor choices in men. You have bad judgment. Every one of those statements made to a mother who's a victim of violence is shifting responsibility for the violence that he's doing as a parent off of him onto her. And if you want to partner with her, you want to support her, this is the kind of shift that we need to make, which is she needs to know that you believe that he's 100% responsible for his choice to get violent, and that he's 100% responsible as a parent for the implications that has for the family. That's one of the most basic takeaways I have to offer you about sort of the intersection of this work around responsible fatherhood and domestic violence. I think I've got like 5 minutes? 10 minutes. I've got 10 minutes. Okay. Wow, that's very brave. So the only way I can take your question is if everybody else agrees, nobody else will ask a question after that. No, go on. If you took the guts, go ahead. Go for it. Why are you asking that question? I'm going to try to do this. Why are you asking that question? Seriously, what's the importance of that question?
Is it worthwhile keeping the father in a relationship or being able to be rehabilitated, or is it always going to be an issue?
There's a couple ways I want to answer that question. And one is that, what's that? Oh, thank you. Repeat the question. That's why we don't do question and answer in a large group. She's saying, what's the chances of people who are perpetrating violence changing? Okay. And I have a couple ways to answer the question. It's a very common question. A couple ways to answer it is, I don't want people to, I'm going to kind of give a kind of caveat. I don't want people to boil down this conversation down to whether domestic violence perpetrators can change or not, whether people should stay or not. Because staying doesn't guarantee safety, leaving doesn't guarantee safety. And I think part of the issue has been is that we formulated this as a relationship-based issue, not a perpetrator pattern-based issue. And what I mean by that is, and you all can ask yourself this question yourself, which is how often when you heard about domestic violence, your first thought is, well, is she going to stay with him anymore? Well, is she going to leave him or not? When is she going to wise up? When is she going to learn? Again, unfortunately, I can't not think about what's going on right now in the media. When is she going to learn what's wrong with her? And the idea behind that is that separation and leaving the relationship equals safety for herself and her kids automatically. The simple thing is, will it make it better if you leave? And so one of the things is when you have a perpetrator pattern-based focus, which is 100% responsibility for a domestic violence perpetrator for their choices, then what you do is you stop asking those questions about, well, is leaving or ending the relationship the answer, and what's wrong with her about whether she's not leaving? The question you'd be asking is, what will make things better? What will make things safer? And then the question is, one thing that will help is she needs to hear that you don't blame her for his choice to get violent. That's one of the core things that victims need to hear, particularly as a parent. They need to hear that he's making parenting choices. One of the ways to shift this guilt and the shame is to say, he's making parenting choices and hold men to higher standards. Ray Rice made a parenting choice. He made a series of parenting choices. It isn't just his work that's a parenting choice. It isn't the way he plays with his baby isn't just a parenting choice. The way he treats his wife, and the mother of his children is a parenting choice. He needs to hear that. She needs to hear that. Again, I have no idea. They may be hearing all this. It's not in the media. It's not the way we're talking about it. I'm sorry for using them. That's why I don't like using examples like that, because I don't know them. But I think it's really important. And so going back to your question is accountability starts with the way we talk about him. Accountability starts with the way we talk to her. Accountability starts with the way we talk to him about his responsibility. How much he engages Some guys, what I'm going to say is, some guys change, some guys don't. Some people with violent change, some people don't. I could give you statistics around it. There's stuff about programs. There's different things. It's a bigger question about that. But the way you know somebody's changing is, guess what? They act different. They become less controlling. They stop being violent. They treat you better. They support you as a parent. So part of it is when you're talking to somebody who says, well, he's going to this program, or he's different, or he promises me that he won't do it again, you don't need to quote statistics. What you can say to her is, help me understand what he's doing and saying now that makes you believe he's going to act differently. Well, he says he loves me, and he says that he wants to be with us forever and us to be together as a family. And then if you say to her, but you told me yesterday that you don't want him in the house for the next month, how did he respond to that? When you said you just don't want him, you want him out of the house for a month, so you have some breathing space. Oh, she said he didn't like that. He said he wanted to move right back in right away. If he's changing, change looks like giving up control. Change looks like accepting the consequences. Change means accepting that somebody may not want to be with you. Change means saying, I was wrong for what I did. Those are real markers of change. And part of, there's a lot more that I could do that I do in longer presentations. But one of the important things to help work with women is to understand what change with domestic violence perpetrators looks like or doesn't look like, so they can use it as information. And one of the things that we've done is we've shifted the focus off domestic violence perpetrators when we focus on, well, is she going to end the relationship or not? No, that's not the question. How do we help her be safer? We shift the focus off perpetrators when she says, I still love him, and we roll our eyes and go, what's wrong with her? What's wrong with, how could she? And I want to ask you, how many people in this room, I'm not going to do a show of hands, how many people in this room are close to somebody, a family member, who's hurt you badly, that you would still say you love them? You may not want to spend Christmas with them or Thanksgiving with them or any holiday with them. You may not want them around your kids. But if I ask you, do you still love so-and-so? You go, yeah, I still love so-and-so. He's family. He's still the father of my children. I still love him. I still don't want him to go to jail. I still don't. And what we do, because we don't hold perpetrators 100% responsible in our own thinking, is she's the one who's codependent. She's the one who's making bad choices. And we have to check ourselves and really be clear, do we really believe that when the domestic violence perpetrator gets violent, they're 100% responsible? I'll give you one more example before I move to wrap up. With social workers working with a young mom. She was probably 18, had a newborn. She was a child in the care of child welfare, and she was starting to age out, but she was living in housing that we were subsidizing. And I got this story from the supervisor. He said to me, you know what, when she first got beat up by her boyfriend, or the father of her child, we were very sympathetic. He said we treated her as a good victim, quote unquote. But when we found out that she broke, now watch your reaction to this yourself, by the way. This is a little bit of an experiment. When we found out she broke the program's rules by giving a key not only to him, but to this other guy, we assumed that she was all about creating drama. Does that sound familiar? And so when we started focusing on how she created drama, and therefore she was somehow responsible for the violence that happened to her. So from their eyes, she went from being a good victim to a bad victim, because she broke the program's rules, and the issue became not the father's choice to get violent, right? Now we're doing gender double standards. She should know better. She's the mother of kids. She's got to provide a good home. She shouldn't be talking to those guys. She shouldn't be letting them into the apartment. She shouldn't be giving them keys. But if you think about if we were doing it differently and holding him to the same standard, we'd be talking about how he's the father of a newborn child who chose to beat up the mother because he was not happy about who she was hanging out with. And that his opinion about who she was hanging out with was more important than his responsibility to that child. So I want you to check out yourself what you do with this example and where you would find yourself. And if you got this information about her giving out keys to two guys or talking to two guys, how you would start reframing it and whether you'd be moving away from equally holding him responsible for his violence and start saying, well, she's the mother of those kids, she's got responsibility of those kids, and letting him off the hook for his choices as a parent. And so a lot of what I've been talking about is embedded in the slides here. And I'm really talking about how when you approach domestic violence through a perpetrator-based approach, that you really highlight the idea that the perpetrator is making parenting choices when they're doing their behavior. There's a lot I'm not going to have a chance to talk about. There's going to be a bunch of slides here that are kind of go on, and I want to get to the very end. When you get to see this, I hope you have a chance to look at some of these themes that are here for engaging fathers around domestic violence. And what you hear is, in talking to the men, and there's some research that's associated with the fathering home visiting program we're doing in Connecticut, that these guys had hopes kids would reach higher social status. They had fears for daughters about predatory men. They want their children to be able to talk to them about anything. These are themes from fathers in general. They had tension between seeing violence as a way of the street and the way you get by in life, and contradictions between that and hitting women. They really struggled with that. They wanted to be a financial support for their kids and their families. Many of these guys are trauma survivors. They've been through a lot themselves, often at the hands of their fathers or stepfathers. And so what we got out of this research, and again, I'm moving through this really quickly to get to finish up, is that once you start engaging men and talking to men about their lives and their circumstances, men have a lot of things that they want that you can use to engage them and talk to them about helping them deal with the domestic violence. Because if they want their kids to do better financially, how can you justify causing your girlfriend or wife to lose their job as helping your kids out financially? And I've worked with men, by the way, who work in 2 jobs to put their kids into private school, and then giving her drugs, beating her up and giving her drugs and saying she's an addict. And what we did with that one guy is we said, so you seem to really be investing in your kids doing well. You're working 2 jobs, your kid's going to a private school. How do you think your violence to their mother helps your kids achieve in life? Since you seem to be so committed to getting your kids to achieve in life, how do you think that affects it? So really we worked with the contradiction there. These are just a few of the recommendations that you may want to take away from this talk related to domestic violence, fatherhood, working with families at the intersection of those 2 things. Make sure your family assessments explore father's roles in the family. How does he support you as a parent? What are your hopes and fears for his relationship with the children? What kind of support does he need to be a better parent and more supportive of your parenting? Those are just examples of questions you can ask. Communicate a balanced sense of the importance and impact of fathers on families. Approach families with a basic understanding that fathers are just as responsible for their kids as mothers are. So these are all the things that I was saying. And explore with her what kind of support he needs to be a good parent. Bring it up more than once. If you touch on her relationship with the father of the kids once, during one appointment, during the initial assessment, that's not going to convey to her that you think he's important and what he's doing matters to her and the family. Look at whether you bring it up more than once and on a regular basis. That's the way you kind of model for her the importance of his choices. And then communicate with her that his treatment of her, respect of her, is part of him being a good parent, and be explicit with that. If you've got fathers in the families that you're working with, be curious about his role, his experience of being a dad. What's it like for you? When? How is it for you? How did you find out? How did you feel? Engage him about what he needs. What we find is that folks may have an inclination to talk to fathers about things. I love the home visitor who's talking to mom about the second baby that they're talking about having, and the father's in the other room, and the father overhears this conversation about family planning and calls from the other room and says, "Don't you think I should be part of the conversation? This is not a violence issue." And he calls, and the home visitor, God bless her, what she said is, "I said to him yes, but I didn't know what to do after that." But I think that's really kind of a state-of-the-art kind of thing, which is she knows that he should be involved in that conversation, but she hasn't had any training or support to have that conversation. So one of the things I want you to think about is the training and support. Review your own biases and expectations about men as parents, your own thinking that men aren't important, that men are irresponsible, that boys will be boys is different than doing an assessment. That he's not going to change isn't assessing whether this guy can change. Review your own expectations of mothers as parents. If you're walking around thinking mothers are supposed to do it all, can do it all, again, it's this gender double standard. Get training about working with men. And then this moves on to agency stuff. Train staff to work to understand men's role in families. Train staff to engage men from a perspective of high standards. Don't accept that him walking across the visitation room floor and not dropping the baby is enough. That's not good enough for kids. That's not a good enough expectation. And then look at the tools and policies to address domestic violence and fatherhood that your agency has, and really how it kind of all gets tied together. This is the commercial end of the talk here. You know, there's resources, we have a conference. I hope that, it's winding up time, I hope that having somebody stand up in front of you and do this for a while, or mime walking across a visitation, you know, cradling a baby's head, really kind of gave you something to kind of visual to connect this to, and to really think about this idea of what does it mean to think about fathers' roles in families, how they influence mothers and their parenting, and how that ties into assessing for domestic violence and working better with mothers around their safety and well-being, even if you never work with dads. And I appreciate that most people in this room are not working with fathers, and really try to tailor the talk to this. I know I'm doing a workshop after this, so they'll be more focused on working with domestic violence survivors more particularly. So I hope some of you, not all of you, show up, because I doubt the room is big enough. No offense intended. So anyway, thank you very much.